Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Dr. Nora Slanimsky, and I'm the Gardner Assistant Professor of History and Director of the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies, or ITPS, here at Iona. As a quick reminder, this event is being recorded, and we'd ask that everyone keeps themselves on mute when they're not speaking. On behalf of the Data Science Working Group, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Leah Hendrickson. Dr. Hendrickson is a lecturer in digital media at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom, which is why she's zooming in with us today. She leads the School of Media and Communications Master's Program in New Media and also teaches in the undergraduate digital media program. Leah's current research projects investigate the social and literary implications of textual technologies, commercial and community applications of digital storytelling, and social perceptions of artificial intelligence. Her recent book, Reading Computer-Generated Texts, was published by Cambridge University Press last year, and she's also published numerous, and I mean numerous, co-authored and individual articles on subjects ranging from creativity and machines to stylometric analysis of class authors to agency and language generation systems. She's the social media editor for the digital publication Sharp News, and you can follow her on Twitter at Leah Hendrickson. As part of Iona's Month of Excellence in Scholarly and Creative Activities, Dr. Hendrickson's talk today, Let's Get Digital, Using Digital Humanities to Embrace Data Fuzziness, will draw on several of these themes. So without further ado, I turn it over to you, Leah.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Nora. So I'm going to share my screen. I will preface this by saying that I have intentionally made this lecture quite informal. You'll see I put some effort into my slides, but I don't have a script. I'm going to see where this goes. I know what I want to say, but I wanted to kind of be able to bounce off you if you had any questions or comments. So periodically throughout this talk, I will be checking the chat. If something doesn't make sense, or if you have a question, please, by all means, pop your comments and questions into the chat, and I will, I will check them out every once in a while. So let's get started. I mean, at this point now, I'm not even sure if people here know the song I'm referring to. I hope so. I hope y'all haven't been living under a rock this whole time. But Olivia Newton-John, let's get digital, digital, let's get physical, physical, using digital humanities to embrace fuzziness. So these are my contact details. If at any point you would like to contact me after the talk, please do. My email address is just my name at leeds.ac.uk, and you can also find me on Twitter at this address. Do be mindful that it's Hendrickson without a D. If you tweet at Leah Hendrickson, she's very nice, but she's not the right person. So on to the talk. I like to start my talks with the world's most unflattering photos. And the reason I do this is because for this talk, the photo that accompanied the abstract for this talk was me looking pretty fresh, looking pretty good. But these are all the behind the scenes kind of awkward, horrible photos that that helped me get to that point. And I think in a conversation about digital work, in a conversation about data, it is actually useful to think about all the messiness and all the awkwardness that happens behind the scenes. Additionally, I just think these are hilarious and probably more accurate reflection of my actual day-to-day life. But here is me. So I'm making myself a little bit vulnerable for you here. Here are some of the most unflattering recent photos that I have taken. So I was asked to do this talk. And it seems that this program has a number of different titles. So there's data science for future presidents, careers in science. There's tons of ways of referring to this talk. And I feel a bit awkward being here because I didn't do a degree in data science. I didn't do a degree in any kind of science subject, really, but I'm still engaging in these conversations. I'm still very much part of these communities. So data science, sure. Careers in science, sure. But actually, as Nora pointed out, my role is a lecturer in digital media. I'm a media studies scholar. I have been the entire time I've been in academia. I also lead the MA in New Media, which we're changing our name to Digital Media next year or the year after. And I identify as a digital humanist in a lot these conversations. In particular, my research focuses on artificial intelligence, AI, and social perceptions of that artificial intelligence, the ways that we speak about AI, the potential ethical issues with AI. I talk a lot about that. And I spend a lot of time writing about digital storytelling as well. So the ways that we communicate messages using digital media, using these tools. But my background is in book history. So I have 2.5 degrees in the history of the book. If you ever want to talk about medieval manuscripts and communications history, I'm your gal. And that is really where I come from for all of my research. So I'm not coming at any of these digital kind of media things with a data science perspective. I'm coming at these things with a very humanities perspective, a very social sciences perspective. I'm interested in the sociologies of these technologies and the ways that we use them to communicate, but I won't really be able to talk to you much about the technology and the way that the technology works in any kind of great detail. And because I get asked every day of my life in the UK, where my accent's from, my accent's Canadian, and a little Canadian flag. So at this point, we're going to just start with an interactive activity. This is the only point in any talk where I ask students to get their phones out, to get their devices out. And if you can follow this link, I'll leave the QR code up for a moment. But if you don't have it, the link will also will be there at the top of the screen for you. But if you want to scan the QR code or go to menti.com, and you'll be asked to enter the code that is on this screen. I'll give you a moment to do that. And while I'm doing this, we'll actually go to this link here. Thank you for doing the hearts. The hearts are really helpful to just give me a feel for who's there. Once you're in, maybe, yeah, you can click the heart, just let me know you're there. On the next slide, no worries if you're a bit slow getting here. The information will still be at the top of the screen. So if you click out by accident, or if something happens, you'll know how to get to this screen. So on to the next slide. Before we get started, it's really useful because I'm not in the room with you and I don't know any of you, aside from the organizers. I want to know where you're coming from. So when you think of the word digital, what comes to mind? On your device, you should be able to see 3 or 4 little things where you can write your answers. These are anonymous and you can submit them as many times as you like. So if you have more than 3, great. If you only have 1 or 2, that's fine too. But if you can submit, we can see 3 people, 4 people have submitted, thank you. And I'll just give you a moment to reflect on that. It's a word cloud, so the more times a word comes up, the bigger it will be. All right. I will keep, I'll keep this open, so please do keep adding to it. I can respond accordingly. But right now on my screen, I'm seeing things that are not super surprising, things like computers, online, technology, programming, social media. So you're pointing out the different ways of accessing these digital technologies, the different ways of using them. You're also talking about the kind of haptic, physical experiences of digital media. So things like fingers, overarching concepts like science. You have, you're pointed out the interaction that's happening there. Data's coming up, great. You're really prefacing this talk nicely. Discrete, would like to know what you mean by that. I have my own ideas of what discrete means, but that's an interesting and useful addition. Phones, autonomy, so we're moving into like social concepts now. We have autonomy, no control. Really interested to see what you mean by no control. If anyone wants to explain their answers in the chat, that's great too. Wide ranging, I would agree. And screens is coming up too. So you'll probably see here that some of these answers are not that surprising. I kind of expect computers to come up quite a lot. That's how we access digital technologies. That's, how many people interact with this stuff. But things like this, it always surprises me what people pick out. No control has never come up before for me. Somebody had entertainment as well, convenient. AI is coming up, different particulars of digital media and different manifestations of digital media. Really, really interesting stuff. I'll leave this open. If you would like to add to it throughout the talk, by all means, feel free to do so. We can always revisit this in the question period, but I'm going to close this now. This is just a really good way of helping me see where you are and set us up for the talk well. So thank you for participating. I'll go back to my screen. So, great. Now that we've done our kind of what digital means, I want to talk to you a little bit just to set you up for what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this talk. I want to give you a little bit of information about what I mean by data fuzziness. So you'll recall that the title of this talk is embracing digital, or using digital humanities to embrace data fuzziness. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with this term, so I'm going to just break it down really, really quickly, because it's not something that we usually see in humanities research. So the concept of data fuzziness was first brought to our attention by Lofty-Zadeh in 1965 in an article where he writes about fuzzy sets. And I've just pulled a quotation that I feel really nicely summarizes what he means by fuzzy data. So he writes, "More often than not, the classes of objects encountered in the real physical world do not have precisely defined criteria or membership." Sorry, that's a typo on my, or criteria of membership, sorry. "The class of beautiful women or the class of tall men do not constitute classes or sets in the usual mathematical sense of these terms. Yet, the fact remains that such imprecisely defined classes play an important role in human thinking, particularly in the domains of pattern recognition, communication of information, and abstraction. The concept in question is that of a fuzzy set, that is, a class with a continuum of grades of membership." And I've underlined the one sentence that I think actually, let's pull that apart a bit. Let's think about that. So the fact remains that such imprecisely defined classes play an important role in human thinking. What is he saying? Great article. This guy is not known for his clarity or conciseness. So let's look at the too long didn't read version of this article, which I have I think very helpfully pulled out for you. So too long didn't read, black and white thinking doesn't always work. We can try to categorize things, we can try to sort things nicely, but as people, we know that black and white thinking is not always suitable. Something is not always going to be this or that. A lot of things in this world exist in these gray areas. And for Zadeh, that's what he is responding to. He's saying maths and sciences are too black and white. We need to start thinking about those gray areas. He does argue that we can calculate the gray areas, and there's been a lot of work in fuzzy data, that whole area where they're aiming to calculate the kind of fuzziness. But as a humanist and as a social scientist, I love this argument. This is so true. Yes, we can have maths and sciences, and those categories are so useful for helping us to make sense of the world around us and make sense of ourselves, but we need to embrace the gray areas. And this is really what I want you to get out of this talk today. I want you to be able to feel comfortable saying, you know what, I don't know, or there is no answer. And a lot of the times there is no answer to the digital media stuff we're doing. And that's the only right answer, is there's no answer. So when I talk about fuzzy data, I just kind of want an excuse to have a cute cat on the screen. But when I talk about fuzzy data, I'm really talking about blurriness. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know in the chat. But I'll assume that we're all okay with fuzzy data just meaning the gray area, the blurriness. And I'm simplifying it a little bit, but not in a way that I feel is untrue to Zadeh's intention. So some key points before we move forward. Computers run on numbers, and we typically think of data as numerical. This isn't always true. We know, obviously, that data are qualitative and quantitative. Quantitative are the things that you count. Qualitative are the things that aren't really countable. They're more observational. But computers ultimately run on numbers. So this means that the information that we collect needs to be converted into numbers somehow. The issue with this is that numbers are often non-representational rather than representational. And I've italicized this just to indicate that this is a term I don't assume that you're going to know. But non-representational means we're making something more abstract. So when we have a representation of something, it looks kind of like what we expect to see in real life. So for example, a lifelike painting would be a representational representation. But converting a human experience, so for example, converting a sentiment, saying that somebody sounds happy in a tweet, converting that into a number or a numerical category, that's non-representational. So questions we have to ask ourselves: how do we quantify human experience? How do we turn these experiences and these phenomena into numbers? Digital media have tons of new constraints in this respect, right? So we have to work in this numerical way, but there's also tons of new possibilities, which I will go through with you in this talk. So I want you to be aware of the constraints, but also be aware of those possibilities. We have to use maths, categories, and so forth. And I use the plural maths because in the UK, God knows why, they put an S at the end of math. Still seems wrong to me after all these years, but fine. But the real fun, at least in my opinion, is in the fuzziness. It's in the kind of stuff that doesn't fit. My whole talk and my whole approach to this is deeply, deeply informed by this work here. And I know that Lauren Klein actually came and spoke to you last year, I believe. I'm extremely envious. I absolutely love her work and I would love to hear her talk. But this 2020 book by D'Ignacio and Klein called Data Feminism has just deeply influenced my own thinking about these topics. And I wanted to share that with you. It's a really readable book, and there's a fantastic audiobook version as well for those who would prefer to consume that information that way. But I've identified some key points that I think are worth just reflecting on as we move forward into our conversation about digital humanities in particular. So throughout Data Feminism, D'Ignacio and Klein, obviously, they point out the very obvious fact that you can't do digital without data. And again, we're talking mostly about that numerical data here and how we kind of abstract the qualitative data and turn it into numbers. But you can't do digital without data. However, the ways we collect data are political. The ways we manage data, political. The ways we curate data, political. The ways we use data, political. Even if we don't know this, even if we do this unconsciously, we have our own motivations, we have our own perspectives, we are not neutral, these technologies are not neutral, and it is vital that we keep that in the back of our minds. They use a term, they actually coin a term that I really, really like here. So I'm going to give a shout out to Big Dick Data. Big Dick Data is a term that D'Ignacio and Klein use to refer to these people who go in, they go into funding applications, they go into classrooms, they go into research papers, and they say, we have huge amounts of data. We are going to solve all the problems. We are going to cure cancer on the side. We're going to do all of this cool stuff with this massive amount of data. But for D'Ignacio and Klein, Big Dick Data refers to all talk and no substance. So when you are talking about these kinds of digital uses, digital media uses, try to be realistic. You don't need your big dick data. You just need, regular size dick data. I don't know, this is getting weird. We're going to move on. What D'Ignacio and Klein say in the chapter following as well is worth reflecting on. And they use the quotation, "What gets counted counts." Again, keep this in mind. Go back to that Zada quotation where he talks about how those categories, I think it's like tall, beautiful men or something, the categories don't always work, right? So what we think is worth counting, that is our subjective interpretation of what's valuable, right? So think about as you're collecting data, as you're analyzing your data, what are you counting? What are you not counting? Who are you not counting? Because at the end of the day, all of these data come from people. And this is the crux of the D'Ignacio and Klein book. The fundamental point is, who do these data represent? How do they do that? Why? Who is paying the price unintentionally or intentionally, for technological advancement. So think about, these are all things we need to consider with data. And as you'll see, these are really, really relevant to questions of digital humanities, which ultimately aims to kind of bring back the human in the data. So I'm going to move on to a little introduction to DH, to digital humanities. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So at this point, I'm assuming y'all are fine. But again, if you are not fine, if you have a question, a comment, a complaint, or a compliment, pop it into the chat and I will address it. But for now, we move swiftly on to the field of digital humanities. So I really like this quotation. This is a new book by Martin Eve. Martin Eve is really kind of entrenched in these digital humanities conversations. He knows his stuff. If you're ever looking for a really good scholar on open humanities, open data, digital humanities, do check out his work. He begins his latest book, and I think this might actually be the first passage of it, if not the second sentence or something. And he writes, "You may or may not have heard, but over the past 2 decades, a secret and dangerous movement has been growing in humanities departments around the world. Sapping all of the conventional funding out of traditional humanistic pursuits, the so-called digital humanities, or DH to those in the know, brings a grim entrepreneurialism and technocratic mindset to English, history, classics, archaeology, and any other disciplinary space on which it can lay its hands." I wish this were an exaggeration. But actually, these are some really real concerns. I've been involved in digital humanities research for about 7 years now, pretty comfortably, maybe more. And people are still scared as hell. They feel threatened. People are unsure of what to make of these digital media. They don't necessarily realize that in order to do digital research, we can't just obsolesce human researchers. We need the human researchers. No one is trying to take your jobs. What we want to do, and he writes here that we're sapping all of the conventional funding out of traditional humanities pursuits. No one's saying that digital humanities needs to replace more traditional methods of research. And I want you to just keep that in the back of your mind, is if you choose to kind of engage in digital humanities conversations, you will be met with some resistance. And I'm hoping that you can convince your peers that no one's trying to replace them. We're just trying to add something else. We're trying to give you a fresh perspective, trying to complement what you're already doing. And this is why I really, really like this definition from Burdick et al. They came out with this book, Digital Humanities, in 2012. It's an oldie, but a goodie, and I keep coming back to it. And the book itself is just aesthetically pleasing. So here's a screenshot of the book because I think it looks nice. But this is the definition that they provide. I will read it out, and I've highlighted some of the bits that I feel are particularly useful. So they write that digital humanities is born of the encounter between traditional humanities and computational methods. With the migration of cultural materials into networked environments, questions regarding the production, availability, validity, and stewardship of these materials present new challenges and opportunities for humanists. In contrast with most traditional forms of scholarship, digital approaches are conspicuously collaborative and generative, even as they remain grounded in the traditions of humanistic inquiry. As well, the changes the culture of humanities work as well as the questions that can be asked of the materials and objects that comprise the humanistic corpus. So I've highlighted the bits in just random colors that I think look nice, that I think are particularly useful. The one that I really, really like is changing the questions that can be asked. All of a sudden, we have new tools to approach old problems in fresh ways. We might not find any new solutions, but we can try using these new tools. And throughout the next few slides, right on time, throughout the next few slides, I'm going to go through some of my own applications of these tools and show you what I think Burdick and al mean and what they mean to me. So in the second part of this talk, let me hear your data talk, data talk. I really hope y'all know this song, because otherwise you're going to be like, what have I just watched? She was talking about penises and singing Olivia Newton-John. So here are some examples of different ways that we can use data to approach old problems. And I'm just going to go through them, and we can talk about the ones that interest you more in the chat later on. So I won't go into great amounts of detail, but I'm happy to go into more detail in the chat if these interest you. So here's one research application of these kinds of new digital tools. And in this case, I feel I'm representing data. So this comes from a paper that I wrote with a Victorian studies scholar. So a scholar who knows a lot about the Victorian era, and she's a literature scholar. I'm not a literary scholar. I'm not a Victorianist. I know pretty much nothing. I know the names of some Charles Dickens books. I'm not going to read them. And I sure as heck didn't read all these books. So this is what we're doing here. So, and the article's coming out next month if anyone wants to look at these more detail or learn more about the methodology we used. But I was brought in to do some of the computational work related to stylometry. And stylometry is essentially the study of authorial style. So how do you write? How often do you use certain kinds of words? And I did the programming for this. We put in about 200 or so Victorian novels by the Trollope family. So Anthony Trollope is the most well-known Trollope, but his wife, his mother, his brother, all of these people are also prolific writers in the time. And we wanted to know if family relationships had anything to do with authorial style. How did the family relationship, because this was quite a close family, influence the authorial style of these writers? And so you'll see here that we used a principal components analysis in the bottom left corner, multidimensional scaling in the the top left corner, and we also have a cluster analysis on the right-hand side. And really each color represents one author, and we can see certain titles. While the authors are generally pretty clustered, certain titles have some overlap. So I was brought in to do the computational work, but this Victorianist I was working with was the one responsible for figuring out why our data looked the way it did, why our results looked the way they do. And she was really interested in figuring out what titles may have actually been co-written by certain members of the family, because we know that they had editorial influence. We know that some titles were worked on together, but we couldn't identify which ones. Now, I do want to stress that by just doing this kind of computational analysis, we can't answer the questions conclusively, because we can't talk to the Trollopes. We don't know. We have some historical sources that we used that provided some necessary context, and we had something that pointed us in a certain direction, but this was more of a signpost than anything else. This flagged to us what titles we might be interested in looking at. And throughout the article, we talk about why these computational tools are used, but also acknowledge that these aren't evidence in themselves. These are just, little signposts telling you, hey, this is kind of neat, look over here. So this is something we did. We approached these 200 books that neither of us had read in their entirety, and we got to learn something new about them, or we think we did. That's one project I was involved with. Another project that I've been involved with, a couple projects, and I'm not going to dwell too much on this, is that was a very practical application of digital humanities, very practical consideration of here's how you can use the tools, and here's basic programming knowledge. Doesn't take very much, to be honest. Basic programming knowledge, and you can make things. You can make some cool visualizations. I do think it's also important to give a shout out to theory here. I'm mostly a theoretical scholar, so I have a lot of colleagues who do practical work like computing and creative computing. In my job, spend most of my time just sitting and thinking really hard. And that is what this looks like. So here are two papers. The first one just came out on the left-hand side. It's just come out in New Media and Society last month or something. And the next one, Hermeneutics of Computer-Generated Texts, will come out next month. And it's just important to realize that actually, in order to do this work, we do different kinds of work. We have practice, we have theory, and they really play off each other. So for example, in the second one, the hermeneutics piece, half of that article is actually written by a computer that we trained to write academic papers. So half of it's written by us and half of it's written by a computer. And we see practice and theory in that case merging in a really interesting way to give us new perspective on the very, very old field of hermeneutics, which is the study of meaning making, for those who haven't heard that term. And I'm seeing Benjamin, can you talk about what source of data you were using to complete text? Yeah, so Benjamin, good question. So just going back to this slide here, what kinds of data we're using? All we're using is publicly available Project Gutenberg texts. So all of these texts are in the public domain. They are not perfect. So there is some transcription error in there. But what we found and what the literature says is actually these programs that do that computational analysis can accommodate a lot of noise. So a lot of spelling error and a lot of mistakes. And we found that to be the case in our pilot studies. So we're just using basic text files, really unsexy, basic text files. So that's what we're using, Ben. I'm happy to discuss that more in the chat. Yeah, and the feature used, oh, good, okay. This is my last question about this, so I can just move on and then we can go to the chat. But the feature that we used, Iona, is most frequently used words, yes, but we're using function words in particular. So the words that we typically remove in content analysis, the really boring words that don't actually add meaning to the text, or they do, but not the kind of meaning that we typically analyze. So the, of, he, that kind of thing. And we're basically, that's what stylometry tends to do. If you're interested in stylometry as a practice, there's a great book by James Pennebaker. I forget the exact title, but James Pennebaker is your guy and he can tell you all about it. So moving on. And then the final kind of example from my own practice is commercial applications. So I also do some consulting for commercial organizations who want to know more about digital storytelling, about more humanistic sides of data use and data collection. And in this case, I was approached by some guys from WeDo, all of whom are data scientists, user experience designers, engineers, people without any humanities background. And really what they wanted to do was create a storytelling app that would prepare young adults for interviews. So when you get asked, tell us a time that you demonstrated leadership, empathy. They wanted to give people the opportunity to practice their answers to those questions, but they didn't know how to do that. So they knew they wanted to use stories in some way, but because they had never really focused on stories or humanity side, that kind of thing, they knew they needed to bring someone else in. And that happens to be one of my areas of expertise. So here I am today. So this website, we're going to come out with a product in, I think, a few months' time. We're just in the final point of development, but this is the website that we drafted a long time ago. So emphasizing soft skills. And as a result of my involvement with the team, because it had, like, there were calls where we were raising voices at each other, sending angry GIFs. Things got a bit heated quite a few times because we had this interdisciplinary clash. So even though we were saying the same things, we were using different language to say the same things, and that caused tension, that caused misunderstandings. And it wasn't until we actually stopped and reflected on what we were doing, what was working, what wasn't doing, that we could say, actually, you know, this is what we need to move forward cohesively as a team. We actually turn this into a document. It's available online. I can share it in the chat later on if anyone's interested. But we have 3 lessons that we learned, and each lesson is accompanied by a description from me, from the UX designer, and from the engineer. And we talk about what we learned throughout this process. And this is really important when you're doing digital humanities work, because as you can see, there are very different skill sets at play here. It takes one skill set to be able to program, you know, R, which is the program we used for the Victorian thing. That takes a special skill set. And meanwhile, we need subject knowledge from the Victorianists to figure out how to make sense of that data. And all these people need to come together and work together some way in ways that they haven't really needed to in the past, or they may have been scared of in the past. So how do you do that? How do you bring all these people together? Those people who can do digital humanities projects by themselves really probably shouldn't as well, because there's so much opportunity for misinterpretation of data. There's so much opportunity for finding something and thinking, oh, this is it, this is so good, and then just being proven wrong. And I get proven wrong all the time. I am wrong most of the time. And that's important for us to realize. So really what I wanted to show with this slide is that you need to collaborate, but you also need to think about how you're going to collaborate. You can't just stick people in a room and assume they're going to all of a sudden click and everything's going to work, because people from different disciplines speak different languages. And it's important to establish a common language, a common ground, a shared vision, and all of these things to work together cohesively. So what's our time like? We have a little bit of time, I think. So the final one I wanted to show you. So I've gone through, you will have noticed in the top corners, I've been labeling these kinds of data uses. So things like representation, things like responding, and I've shown you my own practice of how I represent and respond to data. This is a different one. This is activism, and I don't really engage in digital media with the activism sphere in a way that is noteworthy for this talk. But I wanted to highlight one project for those of you who are interested in more activism-focused projects and want to know how you might be able to use digital media to make a statement that kind of really hits home. This is one of my favorite examples. It's a bit old now, so this started in, I think, 2016, maybe earlier. But Kathleen McDermott has a project called Urban Armor, and she explains the project as such. So the goal of Urban Armor is to create an opportunity for viewers and participants to reimagine their relationship with personal technology. That's my underline, to reimagine their relationship with personal technology. How much do you know about the devices you use every day? How much control do you have over their functions? In place of mass-produced, data-focused devices, the Urban Armor pieces are customizable, and intervene in the physical world in ways that are unexpected and often absurd. So not only are the actual projects themselves quite countercultural and controversial, you'll see what I mean in a moment, but the fact that this is a personalized, customizable experience is also somewhat controversial. It's somewhat countercultural, because even though algorithms do contribute to personalized experiences of the web, those algorithms themselves are not personalized, if that makes sense. So the technology itself is not personalized, the output is. Whereas in this case, the hardware is actually personalized, not just the software. And I'm just going to show you one example of this. So this is what the project website looks like, and I'm going to show you the personal space dress. I will spare you the sound. I'll just talk over it so you can see, and I won't show you the whole video, but you can see here. So a woman is crossing the street in what looks to be a fairly normal dress. It looks a bit weird, but you're like, oh, okay, yeah, yes. You can get away with anything these days. She's on the subway. So man approaches, steps a little bit too close, and we'll start to see the dress slowly expand to give her her personal space. So using some sensors that are attached to the dress can respond to the environments using these kinds of digital medias, these mini computers that exist in the dress, to respond to this social issue of women not being given their space and not having their space respected. Alternatively, you could also view this as a woman asserting her right to personal space in a more positive light. So really this dress just expands and contracts as needed. And the rest of this video and the website itself actually tells you how you can make it yourself. It gives you detailed breakdowns on what technology you need, how to make the dress, and gives you a little bit more information. There are some really fantastic projects on this website, and I would really encourage you to look them up. I use this website all the time with my own students, and they think it's fabulous. I think it's fabulous. So we're almost at the end here. So I've gone through some different ways that you can use digital media to enhance your practice in research, to enhance your theoretical work, and now to respond to everyday kind of issues. So as a responsive activism kind of approach. Let's go back to this definition really, really quickly before we wrap up then. So I'll read it out again. Digital humanities is born of the encounter between traditional humanities and computational methods. With the migration of cultural materials into networked environments, questions regarding the production, availability, validity, and stewardship of these materials present new challenges and opportunities for humanists. In contrast with most traditional forms of scholarship, digital approaches are conspicuously collaborative and generative, even as they remain grounded in the traditions of humanistic inquiry. This changes the culture of humanities work, as well as the questions that can be asked of the materials and objects that comprise that humanistic corpus. I've just given you a taste of what this means to me. I could talk about this for days. I actually give courses on this, so I do talk about this for weeks on end. But what I really want you to pull out here is those new challenges and opportunities, that collaboration, and being able to ask new questions. What kinds of questions can you ask and explore using these tools? How can you play and explore and discover using digital media? And how can you complement your use of digital media with more traditional methods that we know are tried and true and trusted? Because we don't want to ignore those either. Remember that we're dealing with the encounter between traditional humanities and computational methods. We're not dealing with a brawl where one comes out winning. We're dealing with a kind of meeting point. So to wrap up, to kind of, hopefully this is actually a perfect timing. I'm pleased with myself. To wrap up, I just want to identify some key takeaways that I hope you have from this talk, from this very quick sweeping overview of what I've said. Digital tools are great for play and exploration. They're great for just having a good time, for exploring new issues, for just trying to approach old problems in new and fresh ways. But collaboration is an absolute must. No one expects you to be able to program a full robot and to also be able to do some killer theory and, turn it into a commercial enterprise. These are all very, very different skill sets, and you need to have, at the very least, informal conversations with your peers who can push back, who can ask you questions, who can make sure that you can explain why you're doing what you're doing, And if we go back to that D'Ignacio and Klein, who you are collecting data from and why. Remember, what gets counted counts. Something I've learned as well, you're probably wrong at least some of the time. I'm wrong a lot of the time, and we need to be more comfortable with saying, you know what, I have no idea what these data are telling me. I have no idea what this analysis means. I may have misinterpreted it. This is that fuzziness that comes in, right? Remember, embrace the fuzziness as you would an especially fluffy cat. It's good. It's a good thing. The gray area is something we should enjoy. And finally, go forth and fail, and go forth and flail. Forward, ideally, but sometimes backwards, sideways, doesn't really matter as long as you're having a nice time. So with that, those are my key takeaways. And now, and I promise this is my final really kind of groan-worthy pun, Iona, hear your questions and comments. There's me.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was really terrific, and I, for one, think your puns are fantastic. I have here. Right. There's just so many options. I have several questions myself, but before I jump into those, is there anyone in the chat or who would either like to ask the question in the chat or take themselves off mute and chime in that way? Are there any other questions before I start in?
There's a point by Casey in the chat. Great presentation. Thanks, Casey. I had to become so much more comfortable with quote unquote failing and retrying when I began working with data after being trained in the humanities. Casey, yeah, absolutely. I think this is a larger societal problem, I think, where we tend, and it's sorry, I'm going to complain about the UK government for a brief moment here. One of the things that the UK government does really poorly is assume that numbers are the be all end all. And I'm sure this isn't just this government, but what's happening is we're seeing numbers as kind of evidential ends, like they're objective truth. There's nothing to them. And I think the kind of idea of failure the reason I welcome it is because numbers are never objective. Numbers are, they're always subjective. What we choose to count, that's subjective. How we choose to analyze, subjective. The scientific method, while great and replicable, still subjective. And I think that idea of failure becomes a lot less scary when you realize that actually a lot of the time we're just talking about subjective data here, but it's packaged in a way that looks really fancy and looks really evidential end. Again, the D'Ignazio and Klein book talks about the visualization and how we kind of get to view things as objective, even when they're not. So Casey, thank you for bringing that up. I think it's just important to recognize that failure often comes from being like, I'm not being objective enough. And it's like, no, embrace your subjectivity. Just be very clear where your bias is coming from and be open to being proven wrong, be open to kind of alternative perspectives. And that's the best way forward, I think. Hopefully that wasn't too much of a digression, but yeah, thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Well, I will hop in then, because again, I have several. And if I could ask you maybe two questions, and one is pretty narrow and one is very broad. So I'll try the narrow one first. Something that's come up in different classes and working with students and in my own research is the tricky line between knowing when something is an error, right? You mentioned, I think in the case of the Trollope family, right, that there were typos and mistakes, right? Because we're human and we're going to make them, as opposed to when something is a deliberate change, perhaps in a quote pirated or reprinted issue or an authorized one, or something that goes through different cycles of publication. And I was wondering just to hear your thoughts in your own methods and your own tools, how you might try to distinguish between what is an error or an accident and what is a deliberate change. And then my second question, and this is something that's popped up more in more informal circles, the more time I spend working and talking with the wonderful data scientists on this call, people are like, well, what do you think the difference is between data science and digital humanities? And I've increasingly come to the conclusion myself that I'm not totally sure. So I was wondering if I could just get your broad, or we could all get your broad thoughts maybe on what differences you see between data science and digital humanities. Of course, they do sort of pursue different goals, but also really how they're connected and how they're very interwoven approaches too. So I will pause there.
Yeah, I mean, I got a piece of paper so I could write down the first question before I forgot, forgot it. So the first question, what is an error, and how we kind of take into account that kind of editing process when we're doing the Trollope. And I'm just gonna use that as an example because there are lots of ways that we could explore this kind of question. So I do want to also pick up, yes, there are transcription errors from the Project Gutenberg because there is human intervention. So we have that human transcription process, and inevitably people are going to make mistakes, but it became worse. There were a few texts that we used. So while we tried to do Project Gutenberg for the vast majority of that corpus, there were a few texts that we couldn't find on Project Gutenberg and eventually had to consult optical character recognition texts, so OCR texts, where a computer takes you take a photo of a text and the computer automatically transcribes it for you. And that is even worse. Those texts are just riddled with errors. And thankfully, that is in our methodology. We do take that into account. But again, the program we used, so it was an R package called Stylo, has massive capacity for noise. And thankfully, we had not too much noise. We had enough to bother us as readers, but not enough that it drastically affected our results. Something worth considering. And if we went back, I think we would go through again and clean up those texts a little bit more. But what is an error? I think for that, this really depends on, as long as you can explain and justify your choices and they make sense and you're being consistent. For me, that's more important than taking into account the kind of idea of like, what is an error? It's just being upfront with why you've done what you've done, why you've used the methods you've used. For us, the only thing that we took into account, so we didn't take into account editorial versions. We just went for the earliest publication date that we could go. Because we were doing such a large scale distant reading analysis, that made more sense for our method. But what we did keep was volumization. So a lot of the more recent publications of these texts consolidate the 3 texts, because they're always the triple-decker book at that point, those 3 texts into one book. And we wanted to keep the volumes separate because the volumes came out at different times. So that's more what we were interested in. If I was looking for more of an individual text analysis, so I do a lot of things. I teach people, there's a YouTube video of me teaching this. I teach people how to do individual text analysis. So if you have one book, here's how you can analyze that. In that case, I would be a lot more concerned with the editorial signposting. So I would look at the text and say, okay, what does each section of the text potentially say to me about the editorial process and the exegesis of this text? So put very bluntly, the editorial process wasn't much of a consideration for the actual computational analysis part. Where it did come in useful was when we had the sections of the text that came out as, hey, you should check this. Then Eleanor, my co-author, went in and she looked at those sections and she tried to match up what she knew about the history and what she knew about these authors. She then tried to make sense of the results using that deep subject knowledge that I didn't have. And this is partly why it was useful, actually, because I was doing the computational analysis and I didn't know anything about these books. So I actually couldn't say if the results were interesting. I could just say, this is what we did. And she then looked at it and was like, this is really interesting. Here's why. So having those different disciplinary perspectives come together meant that we could just bounce off each other in a really interesting way. And that I could do a pretty objective computational analysis because I was like, I don't have a personal attachment to these books. And then when she came in with her deep subject knowledge, she could tell me why actually what we found was important. For the second question, the difference between data science and DH, this is such a heated question. I'm sure most people who've been to any DH talk have heard this question in some form or another, and it's such a hard thing to answer. Is what do you privilege? Do you privilege the digital, the data side, or do you privilege the humanities side? I don't know. For me, in my experience, data science tends to focus on the very systematic collection and curation and analysis of data. So it's a very systematic process. There are kinds of, I'm coming at this from a non-data scientist point of view, so somebody please correct me if I'm wrong. But for me, data science is very much about systematization and really trying to represent the world using categories and seeing how you can get maximum amounts of information into these kinds of categories so that you can do meaningful data analysis of that kind of stuff. And it's the starting point for DH. Like, you can't do DH without the data scientists. You can't do DH without the programmers. You need that hard work to be done. But that's that skill set, is that kind of, okay, how do we systematically look at data and collect data? And then the digital humanists come in and they pad it out with the fuzziness. So the data science for me, for DH, is the bones and some of the muscle. And DH is kind of the fluff that makes it understandable, that makes it fun to deal with, in my experience. But an actual data scientist and someone who is well versed in that field might be better suited to answer that question. But I like being the fluff. I'm okay being the fluff. The fluff's the good part of the cat. A cat without fluff, a Siamese cat is, I'm sorry, it's not a good time. So yeah, that's my answer to that question.
That is a great answer. Thank you. Now I have the image, your wonderful image of the cat slide. Now I'm going to think of that every single time. I'm just going to think of a very fluffy cat, which is perfect. I don't know if anyone else, we're just about at time. We have a few minutes left. So if anyone had any other questions, anything in the chat.
I had one more quick one that, I mean, maybe not a quick answer, but I just figured I would ask. So first of all, this is great. I really enjoyed hearing all of the stuff you had to share about what you've done in terms of applying these data and digital humanities methods to all sorts of different areas. But I'm wondering about, like, with the PCA and the clustering, one of the big things that I often run into is that there are black boxes. And I'm a mathematician. I have a pretty good sense of this underlying stuff, and there's still black boxes. It's still very hard sometimes to say, what does it mean to say that we've got this very nice cluster showing up when we did the principal component analysis? So in terms of the meaning, sort of going from here's the vectors that were high importance to the actual context. I don't know if you could just share a little bit about how you handle that, or if you talk about that at all.
No one would ask. I mean, I can tell you, this is actually, it's not a short answer, but it's not a long answer for me. So when I learned stylo, I was in a 2-week course where we did nothing but stylo, and we had a physicist teaching us who was like, here's how the mathematics works. And by the end of the week, I was very humbled. And I still have no idea. Like, I do know, I understand how the math works. And in the article that we've written, we offer very, very basic explanations of how these things are working, because obviously we're talking to a Victorianist audience, and we don't expect these people to have in-depth mathematical understandings. What we've done is really depend on so we're using the tools, and we're using the tools in accordance with the ways that have been tested. We're not new to these. We're not the pioneers of these tools. We're just applying them to something else. So the way that we got around that was we drew from people who had done this stuff using other texts before, and who had provided very detailed mathematical explanations of what was happening. The makers of that tool had provided like very detailed explanations of the mathematical formula that they were using, and we drew from those. So we weren't starting from scratch, and I would never be able to start from scratch in this thing. But I will say as well, with stylometry, the really kind of crazy thing about this field is the guy who pioneered it, John Burroughs, uses what he calls Burroughs delta to analyze stylometric similarities between texts. And Burroughs, who has been doing this for like 50 years now, I don't even know if he's still alive, he's been doing this for a long time, and he still doesn't know how his own formula works. So the thing about stylometry as a practice is it is so humanities that like even the people who are making the mathematical formulae are like, how does it work though? Like, I don't understand. And you know what, it does work, but we stood on the shoulders of giants instead of trying to climb the mountain ourselves, right? So that's the very easy answer. We did do a lot of research into the maths. So for me, like I off the top of my head, it's been about a year since I touched that article. So I couldn't tell you off the top of my head exactly how it works, but at the time when I wrote it, I was like, I know, I've done the research now, and it is in that article. And we refer to a number of other people who use the same tools and offer much deeper and, quite frankly, better explanations than we do. So hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit of a taste for what we did. It's not that we were working from nothing, but we certainly weren't working from zero.
No, that makes perfect sense. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. And Daniel, thanks for the insight. Canadian accents are always welcome. I am from Toronto. If the Leafs ever win, I will be proud of them. I'm proud of them anyway, but they never win. May the force of Tim Hortons be with you. Thank you, Daniel. Tim Hortons just opened up, actually a few towns down from mine. They're moving to the UK now as well. So I still haven't gone, but I will get myself some Timbits this weekend. So I'm looking forward to that. Thanks, Daniel.
That seems like a perfect note to wrap up on. So with that, I want to thank you so much, Leah, for an amazing talk that was so informative and so engaging, and really appreciate you being with us. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you,
so much for having me. It's been such a great time.